Hello YouTube, Sidekick here with another Surviving the Warbird experience video. Videos about flying warbirds in modern flight simulators like DCS and Microsoft Flight Simulator. Today's video is one that I promised to do when I did the first part of this series. It's going to be a video about the issue of managing a warbird engine in these simulators. This has become a much bigger issue as the fidelity of the simulations have increased and developers have really wanted to let players experience the nuances of dealing with these high-performance piston engines. There's no question that these engines were a significant part of the whole warbird experience. These planes were, in a very real sense, built around their engines, and those engines were operating at the very edge of the technology of the time. In fact, those very large, high-powered piston engines in some way represent really the very end of the evolution of that particular species. Within a few years of the end of World War II, large, high-performance piston engines had pretty mumuch been replaced by turbojets and turboprops. So, the thing to remember about these engines is that even with tens of thousands of engines in service, they were still, well, I hesitate to call them experimental, but to some extent they were still a little developmental. They were operating at the very edge of what was possible to achieve with the technology of the time, and so they weren't as robust or reliable as we have come to expect engines to be. I mean, we would not put up with an engine in our car that was as temperamental as a Merlin, and, truthfully, civil aviation authorities these days would actually probably be pretty unlikely to approve such an engine for use in a commercial aircraft. All of which is to say that if you think these engines are a bit fragile and finicky, you're probably right. I do think that there is a case to be made that some developers, in the rush to make sure that players have to pay attention to the engine, have maybe taken a pessimistic view of how much abuse it takes to cause an engine to fail in flight, but we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the video. For now, let's take a quick trip into the guts, or at least the cartoon guts, of an internal combustion engine so that we know what we're talking about. Now, before I start, I do need to issue the following warning. I'm not a mechanic. I am not a mechanical engineer. I have no particular background in propulsion or combustion technology. I also have no first-hand experience with engines of this type. Everything I am about to say I have gleaned from a variety of easily available sources and from flying a number of different piston-engined airplanes in simulators. There is a very good chance that I will get at least some of the details wrong. If so, please feel free to add your constructive corrections in the comments. The other thing I would point out is that I'm not trying to be correct in every detail. My objective here is to provide a bit of a generic guide to these kinds of engines and some common issues they present to sim pilots, especially those that may be less well acquainted with what is going on under the hood in front of their nose, so to speak. If you want a lot better videos and a lot more detail about some of this stuff, there are a lot of good sources on YouTube and on other places of the web, and maybe I'll put some of those links in the description. Now, none of what I'm going to say is a full replacement for digging around in the manual of any particular simulated aircraft. They're all different. Developers have all made their own choices about how to simulate them. And if you want to know how to fly the aircraft you are flying particularly well, you need to do a little bit of research. But I do think there are some common features that are helpful to understand, so maybe you can appreciate why you need to know the things you need to know. So let's start with a simplified model of a 4-stroke internal combustion engine. By the way, for some in the audience, this is going to be incredibly oversimplified. I'm really not trying to talk down to anyone or bore anyone. I just want to get a few concepts straight, so I'm going to leave out a lot of detail. An internal combustion engine consists of multiple cylinders like this one, connected to a crankshaft, which in turn is connected, in an aircraft, to the propeller. Each cylinder has a piston that moves up and down and whose reciprocating motion is turned into rotational motion of the crankshaft. The engine cycle has 4 phases or strokes. On the first, downward stroke, a fuel-air mixture is drawn into the engine through the intake valve, which opens at the top of the stroke and closes at the bottom. On the next upward stroke, the piston compresses the fuel-air mixture in the top of the cylinder. The fuel-air mixture is then ignited, usually by a spark plug, which I haven't shown here. The force of the resulting combustion forces the piston back down in the power stroke. Finally, at the bottom of the power stroke, The exhaust valve opens and the piston rises, and the spent gases from the combustion are pushed out of the cylinder so the process can start again. Now, all other things being equal, the power generated by the engine is essentially determined by the amount of fuel and air that is sucked or pushed into the cylinder during the intake stroke. Unless you do something to push extra fuel and air into the engine, the air is pushed in by the atmospheric pressure outside. And use a throttle to partially block the flow, so the engine's power reaches a maximum when you're letting in the full atmospheric pressure into the engine. But there's a problem, at least for an aircraft engine. The outside pressure is strongly dependent on altitude. At sea level, the pressure is, nominally, 14.7 pounds per square inch, 29.92 inches of mercury, or 1 ATA, ATA, depending on whether or not you're British, American, or German. However you slice it, though, by the time you get to 25,000 feet, this pressure will be down to about a third of that value, which means that if you don't do something to feed more air into the engine, it will be down to 1/3 of its nominal power at sea level. Now, the thinner air at altitude also means that it's a lot easier to move the airplane, so that doesn't mean that your top speed will be reduced to 1/3 of its value at sea level, but it will be a lot less than it was. And so, to get engines to perform at altitude, it was necessary to come up with a way of forcing more air into the engine. A number of things have been tried, but by the late 1930s, it was pretty much settled that the best way to do this was by spinning a turbine, essentially a big fan, that sucked air in and forced it into the engine. And there were basically two ways of powering the turbine. It could be spun using the mechanical power generated by the engine, using a suitable gearbox attached to the crankshaft. This method was called supercharging. Or the fan could be powered by the exhaust gases of the engine, and this method was known as turbocharging. Now, there are some really good videos on the differences between the two methods, but for our purposes, we can generalize by saying that turbocharging had some significant advantages in terms of performance, but turbochargers were much larger and much heavier than superchargers, and so they were most often used on bombers rather than on fighters. The two notable exceptions were, of course, the P-47, whose massive scale was largely driven by the need to accommodate the turbocharger, and the P-38 that used the extra room in the engine booms to accommodate the turbochargers. For the purpose of managing the engine in a flight simulator, though, the difference between supercharging and turbocharging doesn't really matter very much. The important thing is the ability of the engine to provide a significant increase in pressure of air entering the cylinder, so-called boost. And this was actually one of the main things that separated the various engines of the time. For instance, the Allison engine in the P-40 is often seen as performing particularly poorly because it lacked the complex two-stage supercharger that was necessary to perform well at high altitudes. And so it didn't perform well at high altitudes, and which were the altitudes typical of air combat in Western Europe. In North Africa and the Pacific and even in Russia, though, the P-40 could actually more than hold its own because its engine was designed to run well at the lower altitudes that were typical of combat in those theaters. All of which is to say that regardless of how the boost was supplied, the nature and control of it was very specific to each type of engine and even varied significantly between generations of the engine as various supercharging arrangements evolved and were tried. So you really do need to consult the manual or guide for the particular aircraft you're flying if you want to understand how the boost system works. Know this, though. The need for boost changes constantly with altitude, and so if you are climbing or descending, you will need to pay constant attention to your boost settings in order to reach maximum power, but also to avoid providing too much boost, which is an issue that we'll talk about in a minute. Before we do that, though, we need to talk about another feature of the Warbird power plant, the propeller. In Warbirds, the engine is connected directly to the propeller shaft. The prop spins at the same speed as the engine. The prop consists of two or more blades that are actually little airfoils angled into the air. Turning the prop pushes the air behind it, or alternatively, you can see the turning prop as pulling itself through the air. The angle of the blades, known as the blade pitch, controls how big a bite of the air the blade takes, and of how much power it takes to turn the prop. In the simplest prop arrangement, such as World War I planes, the prop was just a solid piece of wood and the blade was fixed. But fairly soon after the war, a new type of prop was developed. This was the variable pitch prop that allowed the pitch of the propeller to be changed in flight. In this way, the propeller setting kind of acts like a gearbox in a car. The finer the pitch is set, the higher a given power, the higher RPM a given power setting will generate. So high RPM is kind of like the lowest gear in a car, while setting the pitch more coarsely will mean low RPM, which is like a high gear, which is efficient at high speeds. The initial variable pitch props solved the problem of needing this kind of gearbox, but they resulted in a lot of extra work for the pilot, because every time the power was changed, the pilot needed potentially to adjust the prop pitch. So the next development that provided a much better solution was the constant speed prop. A constant speed prop uses a mechanical governor arrangement of some kind to maintain a constant speed of rotation by allowing the prop blades to change pitch to accommodate the power coming from the engine. So as power is increased, the blade's pitch increased and take a bigger bite out of the air. And as power is decreased, the pitch becomes finer, but the RPM always stays the same. So after all of that, the two main engine controls in a Warbird are going to be power, which is effectively controlled by the manifold pressure or boost provided to the engine, and controlled with a combination of the throttle and the turbo and supercharger controls. And the other control is going to be the propeller control, which sets the engine speed or RPM. The other set of controls that you need to be aware of in the cockpit don't actually control the engine, they control the means of cooling the engine. In order for a piston engine to work properly and to avoid damaging it, it needs to run within a fairly small range of temperatures. Running too cold can cause problems because the lubrication system does not work properly if the oil is too cold. Similarly, running when the engine is too hot can cause a variety of problems, from the oil losing its viscosity so that it no longer provides enough lubrication, to the problem of detonation that we'll talk about in a minute, to actually exceeding the thermal limits of some engine parts so that they deform or even fail. The bottom line is that the engine needs to run within temperature limits. In any of these aircraft, there are a number of controls that are used to adjust the cooling system to achieve this. Now, the exact controls will vary from aircraft to aircraft. They'll typically include things like cowl flaps and radiator and or intercooling doors or flaps. And again, you really should look at your aircraft's manual to find out how they can be adjusted. The reason that you will want to make adjustments is because there is almost always an essential trade-off between cooling and drag. Usually when you open flaps or doors to increase cooling, you add drag, sometimes a significant amount of drag. So as a general rule, you will probably want to run with as little cooling as you can get away with. The question is knowing and figuring out how much you can get away with. So finally, we have all of the information about how the engine controls operate. Let's talk about the ways to avoid using them to break your engine. There are three main conditions that you want to avoid damaging your engine. Number one, avoid over-revving. Internal combustion engines have an absolute upper limit on how fast they can operate. Because they're mechanical systems with inertia and other properties, there is only so fast that the pieces can move. If you try to make them move faster than this, things will start happening out of sequence, and that will be bad. For large piston engines with normal valve trains, which is all of the engines in the Warbirds that are modeled in DCS, the main World War II exceptions would be airplanes with the Napier engines that use sleeve valves instead of tappet valves, but I digress. For engines with normal valve trains, the upper limit is around 3,000 RPM. For some engines, it could be a couple hundred RPM less, but if you look, you'll find that basically all of the engines in both simulators top out between 2,800 and 3,000 RPM. If for any reason you allow the engine to exceed this speed, once again, bad things will happen, and probably fairly quickly. Thankfully, you will likely have to work pretty hard to over-rev the engine, because with automatic prop control enabled, the governor will essentially not let you operate at more than the red line value. But if for some reason you operate in manual RPM mode, or if something gets damaged, it is possible to exceed the red line. So be careful that you know where the red line value is on the RPM gauge and react immediately if the engine is exceeding that value. Now, while it's hard to exceed the red line value, it is pretty easy to run at that value all the time. This too is really not a good idea. The red line in these engines really is the red line. It's the not to exceed speed, not the comfortable operating speed. It's also a speed that is guaranteed to result in the absolutely highest possible fuel consumption. So really, reserve maximum RPMs for takeoffs, landings, and times when an absolute maximum of power is needed. At other times, even during extended climbs, get in the habit of pulling the RPMs back to 10% or so below the maximum value. As always, consult the manual for your aircraft. It will no doubt give you approved RPM settings for a variety of activities. The other RPM condition that you have to be aware of is actually under-revving, sort of. What I mean here is the situation where you're running at fairly low RPM, meaning a fairly coarse pitch of the prop, and you suddenly add a lot of power. And this is roughly analogous to sort of popping the clutch in a car with a manual transmission, for those of you who are familiar with driving one of those. The result is that the prop control will take a moment to catch up with the power setting, and in the interim, you could be putting a lot of stress on the whole powertrain, including the engine and the crankshaft. For this reason, when increasing power, it's important to always increase RPM first, and then add throttle, and similarly, when you reduce power, reduce the throttle first, and then reduce RPM. I remember this kind of with the mnemonic spin up, but throttle down. Okay. So that's how to avoid breaking the engine with the prop lever. The second effect that will damage your engine is overboosting. Now, remember, the aircraft you are flying is designed to perform well at altitudes from sea level to maybe as much as 20 or 25,000 feet. The need for extra boost at high altitudes is much greater than at sea level. This means that it is entirely possible to deliver more boost than is safe for the engine, especially at low altitudes, in order to have the ability to deliver it at high altitudes. Why is there a maximum safe level of boost? Well, isn't more intake air pressure always good? Well, no. And that's because gasoline has an interesting property that if you compress it far enough in a warm enough environment, it will detonate spontaneously. And this is actually the principle behind the diesel engine, but again, I digress. The point being is that if you shove too much gas into your engine and you let it heat up, you will end up with a premature combustion, and this is known as knock or detonation, and again, this is bad. At best, you lose power. At worst, the mistiming of the combustion can literally damage the engine and cause parts of it to fail. Now, again, the amount of boost that an engine can safely handle will vary. The biggest determining factor is actually the octane rating of the fuel, which you know nothing about when you fly in a simulator. Without going into it, the higher octane rating, the more resistant the fuel is to detonation. Now, your simulated aircraft will assume a certain octane level, and so it will assume a certain safe level of boost. In the early years of World War II, fuels were rated at 80, maybe 100 octane. As the war progressed, though, the quality of the fuel for Allied aircraft improved dramatically. At the end of the war, the Allied fighters were often running 150 octane fuel, which allowed for manifold pressures of over 70 inches or almost 20 pounds of boost. German fighters typically ran much lower octane fuels, and so operated at much lower levels of boost, typically 1.4 ATA, which is only about 40 inches of manifold pressure. All of which, again, is to say that you should check the manual of the aircraft that you are flying to see what the maximum safe boost level is. Do not ever exceed this number. Even if the throttle will deliver higher manifold pressures, do not go there, ever. Doing so could cause immediate damage to your engine. Now note that there are ranges of boost that will be safe to operate at, but only for limited periods of time. These go by different names for different airplanes, words such as military power, max power, or where emergency power get used. They'll all mean slightly different things in different aircraft, and you'll need to consult the manual to know exactly what they mean. Now, even sometimes the ability of the engine to operate at these extreme levels of boost is dependent on a water injection system, which is a system that injects a mixture of water and methanol into the cylinder head, and which significantly reduces the chance of detonation. But, of course, there is a limited amount of water available, and hence a limited amount of time when the engine can be operated at the power level that requires the water injection. Once again, the only thing you can do here is to consult the manual for your particular aircraft. So, as well as learning what the absolute maximum throttle setting is, find out what the maximum sustain setting is. Learn to identify these settings on the gauges at a glance, and if possible, in your headphones by the sound the engine makes. Stay below the sustained boost level, or at it, unless you have a really good reason to exceed it, and then try to get back under that limit as soon as you can. Okay, that's over-revving and over-boosting. The other way to damage your engine is to overheat it. Now, to some extent this is related to the other two effects, since over-revving and over-boosting can also overheat your engine, but you can also overheat your engine without doing either one of those things. Because basically, how hot the engine gets is going to be not only a function of how hard it's working, but how well it's being cooled, which I suppose is really kind of obvious. Now, how hard it's working is a function of throttle and prop speed. We've already covered that. But how well it's being cooled is a function of a few other things, like how fast the aircraft is moving, because slower flight means less cooling. How high the aircraft is, because higher altitude and lower air pressure generally means less cooling, even though the air is colder. And it also depends on how your cooling system is configured. So, basically flying slowly, but at high power, at high altitude with your cowl flaps and radiator doors closed is a good way to overheat your engine. Now, this can happen during things like a prolonged maximum rate climb, but it also could happen in a tight turning dogfight at high altitude where you're maneuvering aggressively and constantly and trying to keep the aircraft in a clean aerodynamic configuration. So once again, exceeding your red line temps can have immediate negative consequences without a whole lot of real warning. So once again, your only real protection is to check your manual, know where the oil, coolant, and cylinder head temp limits are, and know where to find them in the cockpit, and learn to identify them at a glance and know if you're headed for the danger zone. If you are, your options pretty much are pick up speed and or lose altitude and or reduce power, as well as getting all of your cooling flaps and doors open as soon as you can. Okay, so that's pretty much it. If you want to protect your engine, avoid over-revving it or over-boosting it or overheating it. Learn what those limits look like, learn how to identify them quickly, and avoid them. Now, before I close, I just want to add one more little rant about how all of this works, how all of this is modeled in simulation. Because I think it's important to remember that the published engine limits for these aircraft were actually designed to prevent the engine from being operated in a way that would reduce its lifetime or make it unreliable or cause its performance to degrade rapidly over time. I don't think that exceeding those limits would result in immediate and irreversible catastrophic damage to the engine. Kind of like in the same way that G limits on modern aircraft work. No professional pilot ever over-Gs their aircraft. To do that threatens their life by making the aircraft unreliable because it's been operated outside its known limits. It also means that the aircraft will have to be taken out of service and completely inspected, and that's a fact that will have professional consequences. But over-G'ing an aircraft will not cause it to fold up like a piece of cardboard and fall from the sky as soon as the G limit is exceeded. Similarly, I believe that any competent Warbird pilot would know the limits of their engine and wouldn't exceed them. To do that would have exposed them to the very serious risk that the engine, the one thing they were depending on to get home, possibly over long distances, was now unreliable and might start working poorly or stop working at all. Their lives quite literally depended on not overstressing their engines. But I don't believe that those engines were so fragile that momentary overstress would cause them to begin trailing smoke, spraying oil all over the windshield, or even seizing up in mid-flight. I seriously doubt that pilots would have been prepared to place their lives in the hands of any machine that fragile. But sim developers have a bit of a problem. I mean, they want sim pilots to respect the real limitations of the planes. They want sim pilots to enjoy a realistic flight experience. But within the boundaries of a sim, they just aren't able to impose the cost on sim pilots that real life imposed on real pilots. And so I think some of them may have opted to impose those costs by making their engines a little bit more fragile than they really were. Now, other developers, I think, have opted to make the engines pretty robust to abuse. I mean, for instance, I literally had to fly around in circles for several minutes on max boost and RPM and minimum airspeed and minimum cooling to break the P-47 for this video. But I also know from experience that other engine models and other aircraft have not been designed to be so forgiving, and they may punish you quite a bit more quickly if you're not paying attention. So either way, as I said all along, your best bet is to learn the aircraft you fly and know how they respond. Hopefully this video will help you understand why you're seeing what you're seeing a little bit better. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and if you have some useful advice, please feel free to contribute it in the comments, or come to the Discord server and join the conversation. For now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.